In 1961, a psychologist at Yale University placed an advertisement in a New Haven newspaper. He was looking for volunteers to participate in a study on learning and memory. He paid them $4.50 for 1 hour. They were teachers, engineers, clerks, salespeople, ordinary people from ordinary lives. When they arrived at the laboratory, they were told they would be helping to test whether punishment improves learning. They were told they would be the teacher. Another participant, calm, ordinary, unremarkable, would be the learner. The learner would be strapped to a chair in the next room and given a memory test. Every time the learner got an answer wrong, the teacher would administer an electric shock. 65% administered what they believed was a potentially lethal electric shock. They were not monsters. They were you. The room the teacher sat in was sparse and clinical. In front of them, a shock generator. The generator had 30 switches arranged in a horizontal line. Each switch was labeled with a voltage, starting at 15 volts, increasing in 15-volt increments, ending at 450 volts. Above the switches, printed labels described the intensity: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock. The final 2 switches were labeled simply XXX. The learner was in the next room, out of sight. The teacher could hear them through a thin wall. At 75 volts, a grunt. At 120 volts, a shout that it was hurting. At 150 volts, a demand to be released from the experiment. At 210 volts, screaming. At 300 volts, a pounding on the wall and a refusal to answer any more questions. At 315 volts, silence. The teacher was instructed to treat silence as a wrong answer and to continue administering shocks. When teachers hesitated, when they turned to the experimenter and said they wanted to stop, the man in the lab coat said 4 things. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, you must go on. That was all. 4 sentences. No threats. No weapons. No incentives beyond the $4.50 already paid. The experimenter did not coerce. He simply continued to expect. And 65% of teachers continued to the end of the dial. Milgram spent years trying to understand why. What he found was not a theory of evil. It was a theory of structure. He called it the agentic state. The agentic state is what happens when a person stops experiencing themselves as the author of their own actions and starts experiencing themselves as the instrument of someone else's. In the agentic state, the question stops being, is this right? It becomes, am I performing my role correctly? The moral weight of the action transfers, in the person's subjective experience, to the authority who gave the instruction. The teacher was not deciding to harm anyone. The teacher was following a procedure. The teacher was doing their job. Milgram found 3 conditions that reliably produced the agentic state. The first, institutional legitimacy. The experiment was conducted at Yale University. When Milgram moved the experiment to a rundown commercial building and removed the Yale affiliation, obedience dropped from 65% to 47.5%. The institution was doing part of the work. Its prestige was a moral permission slip. The second condition, proximity of authority. When the experimenter gave instructions by telephone rather than in person, obedience dropped to 20.5%. Many participants said yes on the phone, and then secretly administered lower voltages than instructed. Physical presence matters. The authority in the room is harder to disobey than the authority on the phone. The third condition, distance from the victim. When the teacher could not see or hear the learner at all, no sounds, no pounding, no silence, obedience rose. When the teacher was placed in the same room as the learner and had to physically press the learner's hand onto a shock plate, it dropped sharply. The uniform was the experiment. Milgram ran 17 variations of the study. He changed the location. He changed the authority figure's clothing. He changed the victim's proximity. He changed whether other teachers in the room complied or refused. The variations revealed something more precise than a single result. They revealed a map of the conditions that produce obedience and the conditions that dissolve it. When two other teachers in the room refused to continue, obedience in the main participant dropped to 10%. The presence of a single person willing to refuse was more powerful than the authority of the institution. One dissenter. That is all it took. When the experimenter left the room and instructions were given by a peer, someone with no institutional authority, obedience dropped to 20%. When the experimenter wore ordinary clothes rather than a lab coat, obedience dropped. When the experimenter himself became the learner, and the learner became the experimenter, participants refused almost immediately. Authority is not a property of a person. It is a property of a context. Remove the context, and the authority dissolves. Change the costume, and the obedience recalibrates. Milgram's map showed something that was more disturbing than a finding about cruelty. It showed that the conditions for obedience are not exceptional. They are ordinary. They are the conditions of most workplaces, most institutions, most systems that human beings live inside every day. Milgram hadn't studied evil people. He had studied normal conditions. Here is where this stops being a psychology experiment from 1961. The office where your manager asks you to do something you know is wrong. The hospital where the protocol overrides the clinical judgment of the person in the room. The military unit where the order is followed because orders are followed. The supply chain where nobody assembles the harm because each step only sees its own task. The compliance department that signs off because the form was correctly completed. The meeting where nobody speaks because the senior person in the room has not spoken yet. None of these are aberrations. All of them are Milgram. Running without a lab coat. Running without a shock generator. Running on the ordinary conditions of organized life. And they are running on you. Right now. In the room you go to every day. In the structure you call your career. In the system you call normal. Today. Milgram's framework gives you 5 signals for when the agentic state is active in you. The first signal. You have stopped asking whether something is right and started asking whether you are doing it correctly. The procedure has replaced the question. The second signal. The moral weight of the decision feels like it belongs to someone else. You are executing, they decided. You are simply the instrument. The third signal. You are more afraid of disrupting the situation than of the outcome of the action. The discomfort of stopping feels larger than the discomfort of continuing. The fourth signal. You are aware of something wrong, but you are waiting for someone with more authority to name it first. You are monitoring the room rather than acting on what you know. The fifth signal. You tell yourself that what happens next is not your responsibility because you didn't design the system. You are following a procedure. You are doing your job. You are just the teacher. When you recognize any one of these 5 signals, Milgram's research tells you exactly what to do. Not argue. Not escalate. Not explain your reasoning to the authority. Stop. Physically stop the action you are performing, because Milgram also found that the participants who stopped, the 35% who refused to reach the end of the dial, did not stop by winning an argument. They stopped by stopping. They did not convince the experimenter. They simply declined to continue. The agentic state ends the moment you reclaim authorship of your own action. Here is the final thing. The thing the Milgram experiment actually proved that most summaries leave out. The participants who continued to the end of the dial were not comfortable. They sweated, they trembled. They laughed nervously. They asked repeatedly whether the learner was all right. They knew something was wrong. They continued anyway. Not because they didn't feel it. Because they had handed the feeling and the responsibility for acting on it to the man in the lab coat. The man in the lab coat did not have to threaten them. He did not have to silence them. He only had to remain calm and expect them to continue. And they did. The most important word in the entire Milgram experiment is not obedience. It is expect. The authority did not demand. The authority expected. And the expectation, quiet, calm, institutional, was enough. Because somewhere inside the teacher was a voice that agreed. A voice that said, "This is the procedure. This is the room I am in. This is the role I accepted when I sat down." That voice is not the experimenter's. That voice is yours. The question Milgram left open is whether you are listening to it or whether you are letting it speak for you.